So I'd like to kick off with some acknowledgements and thank yous. And of course, I want to start with thanking Charles Shackelford and Linda Shackelford for their unwavering support of my programs, my colleagues' programs over the last literally multiple decades, and just their support in general to Oklahoma State University, Stillwater, and Oklahoma State University, Oklahoma City. It's just been phenomenal. And we appreciate you, Charles and Linda. We know you have other diversions, you have hobbies, you have family, you have, you name it, but yet you still share some of the bounty with us and your time, your precious time, and we appreciate that. So thank you if you're listening, or thank you if you catch us on a later YouTube. Also want to thank my colleagues here at OSU campus, our computer people, Mike Lane, Peter Harwell, Dwayne Hunter. Also want to thank Donna Dollins, who's on today, helping me to co-host this. Thank you, Donna, for all of your help today and over the years for sure. I just want to reiterate for some of the rules in case some of you are new. This is your first webinar this year. And our speaker has the choice whether she wants to have a break midstream or not. So I'm going to leave that up to Dr. Baum if she goes straight through or if she calls a break. If she does call a break, we're not going to do questions or anything. We're literally going to let her have a break, and then she can start up in another 10 minutes at that point or whenever she's ready. And then speaking of questions, we'll absolutely have a Q&A session at the end of her talk. And she's committed to staying on board and answering each and every question you might have as it pertains to pollinators and related issues. And just in case you haven't seen her bio or you haven't seen it recently, I'm not going to read it in its entirety because I don't want to steal her time, but I just want to highlight 3 or 4 things about Dr. Baum. So Kristen's Associate Dean for Research for the College of Arts and Sciences and a professor in the Department of Integrative Biology here at OSU Stillwater. She's been studying pollinators in the Southern Great Plains now for over 20 years. Well, that's why I hired Dr. Baum, because she's not a newbie. She knows what she's doing. Boots on the ground now for multiple decades. I'm so excited to have her back. If you joined us in our native plants and our plant material workshops pre-COVID, Dr. Baum has lectured for us before, but today, though, she's going to be virtually, and we're going to have, I notice we're having a little bit of difficulty getting her video up, but we'll do that here in a minute. And her current research focuses on the effects of land use and management practices on pollinators, including butterflies, native bees, and honeybees. And Kristen, if you're able now to go ahead and bring up your screen, feel free to. And otherwise, I think we're having just a little bit of technical problems. Dr. Baum, I can see your name, waiting to see your screen.
Yeah, when I click the start video, it says unable to start because the host has stopped it.
Let me get back on and see if I can.
Repeat that, Dr. Baum. Repeat that.
It says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Okay, I just remade you co-host again. Now try it. There you are.
There we go. Okay.
That's really weird. That's not happened before. Thanks for your patience. So please help me welcome Dr. Kristen Baum. The floor is yours, Dr. Baum.
Okay. Okay, well, this afternoon I'm going to talk about considerations for supporting pollinators from the perspective of growers, but also thinking about it from your customers and what they're interested in, and questions they might be asking you as well based on advice they are given from a lot of the different organizations that support pollinators. So I'm going to go through a couple different topics. I'm going to start with the benefits of pollinators and why one should want to support them, most of which you probably already know. I'm then going to go through pollinator habitat needs. So I'm going to focus primarily on butterflies and native bees. I'm then going to go through some recommendations for things to think about for supporting pollinators from a variety of different perspectives. And then I picked some different topics related to my research that I thought might be of interest. So I just kind of picked a variety of different things. So hopefully, depending on your interest, there'll be something that will be exciting for you. So this is a poster that's available through the Pollinator Partnership that summarizes a lot of the benefits associated with pollinators. So obviously pollination is the one that everybody thinks of. You might also think of resources for wildlife, so thinking of the fruits and the seeds and the other animals that are supported through the activity of pollination, but they list a lot of other topics as well. And again, a lot of it's because of that connection between plants and pollinators and how that works. So thinking about nutrient cycling, our carbon sequestration, erosion control, soil health, water filtration. So lots of different reasons why we would want to support pollinators. And actually on this poster, they highlight some of the other pollinators. So birds are important pollinators, bats in some systems. Of course, we've got flies, beetles, lots of other insects that would come in to contact with flowers and transfer pollen. So one of the common approaches for highlighting the importance of pollinators is to talk about the things we wouldn't have without pollinators. And so I thought these graphics were interesting. They're from Whole Foods. The top, they're looking at produce choices when you have bee pollination available and when you don't. So you can see that you lose a lot of different fruits and vegetables when pollinators are missing from a system. And then they did the same thing with dairy choices. And so some of this, when they make the connection to dairy products, it might be related to thinking about, some of the feed that we have for cattle that relies on pollination, or needing to be pollinated to provide the seeds to plant for those resources. But certainly highlights the importance of pollinators. And so from the producer perspective, so thinking about growers, I mentioned at the beginning that thinking about consumer interest and their interest in supporting pollinators means that a lot of times they're asking additional questions, wanting to know if the plants that they're going to purchase are going to provide the resources that they're interested in. They might also be asking about insecticide use and things that might affect pollinators or wildlife in general. And I think just thinking about all the different organizations out there that support pollinators, that's always one of the recommendations. Some other things they're interested in, what's the blooming period of plants, what types of pollinators are going to visit those plants. And of course, the answer isn't always easy. It's interesting, some plants, when they're blooming, you'll see a lot of activity maybe at the very end of the season or at the very beginning, but, a lot of it depends on, what's the overall perspective in terms of resources that are available, and the choices for the pollinators can change over time as well based on options. So I'm going to start by talking more about native bees. So we have more than 4,000 species of native bees in the US, and they're very diverse. And, a lot of bees, when you kind of get down into focusing, everybody thinks about Carpenter bees or bumblebees or honeybees, but there's some very, very tiny bees that I've had students tell me they thought were gnats or flies and other types of things, but a wide diversity of bees out there. And even if you were to go to a single site and sample across time and maybe across years, you could come up with 100+ species. We've done that for some sites in Oklahoma, so a lot of diversity out there as well. And so this is a nice graphic. So this is showing the largest bee found in North America. So that's a Carpenter bee that's on top of that quarter there. And then there's a tiny little Perdita bee, which is the smallest kind of bee that we have in North America. So kind of putting that in perspective, thinking about diversity. You can also notice that they both have grains of pollen on them as well. So I wanted to kind of categorize our native bees into kind of 3 broad categories and highlight some of the resources needed that are specific to those different categories. So the first group of bees I wanted to talk about is our largest group of bees, so our ground nesting bees. So we've got about 2,800 species. So that's about 70% of the bee species that we have. And so most of these bees are going to be solitary bees, so meaning that each individual bee is going to create its own nest. And so in some cases that might be communal, so there might be a group of them nesting in the same location, but they're each making their own nest, provisioning the cells in their nest with pollen, laying an egg, closing it up, and doing that all over again. And so it's difficult to kind of categorize what's a good site for ground nesting bees, but one of the obvious things would be they have to have access to bare ground. So having some bare ground present is a positive for ground nesting bees. Having sloped sites that are going to drain well, so that there's not issues with them being overly waterlogged, and that sparse vegetation, and then being untilled, so that there's enough structure there for them to build their nest and for them to have the structure they need and the support they need for that nest. The next category is the next largest group of bees. So this would be our cavity or twig or wood nesting bees, and they'll also nest in kind of pithy plant stems. So raspberries would be a good example. Other kind of thick plant stems that have a nice structure to them. And so about 30% of our native bees fall in this category. And so they'll utilize dead, dying trees, branches, plant stems that they find. So if homeowners were to leave behind some of the dead stems, as instead of cleaning those up in the fall, that provides a resource that the bees are using for nest sites for overwintering, which I'll talk about in a minute as well. And then bumblebees was the last group I was going to put in here because they are common and of interest. So there's approximately 45 different species of bumblebees in North America. And so they'll utilize a variety of different types of habitat. They'll create their nest in like small mammal burrows that have been abandoned, grassy thickets, areas where there's dense cover. And so they would be another species. And so when I talked about the twig nesting bees, a lot of those are solitary as well, but bumblebees do form colonies much smaller than what we think about for honeybees, but also kind of that group colonial type of approach to nesting. So I wanted to briefly mention kind of native bee life cycles and what those look like. And so the mason bee life cycle is one that I have up here now. And so those would be ones where if you've seen the kind of paper or cardboard tubes, or they could be reeds or other types of things that people will place in some type of structure to provide a nesting habitat for bees. But you'll see if you look at the top, that they'll provision their nest. So they in that reed or tube. So they're going to start at the very end and place pollen in there, and then lay their egg, and then they're going to seal that off and move to the next one and farther down. And usually the females will be laid first, since they take a little bit longer to develop, and they're going to emerge last. And then the males will be laid last, so they're closest to being able to exit that tube or reed or whatever structure the bee has laid its eggs in, so that way they're chewing out of that layer and are the first to leave the nest, if that makes sense. But the other thing I wanted to highlight for you, so we think about bees here being active in terms of foraging and collecting pollen here in the spring, and different bees have different time periods of activity. So some might only be active for a few weeks, others might be active for most of the growing season. So the activity periods vary a lot. But the other main point would be that once they form their nest and they're done with that part of their life cycle, then the rest of their life is spent in that nest. So a lot of native bees are going to overwinter within their nest. And so that's why when I talk about leaving behind some of that, those kind of pithy or woody stems in gardens is very helpful. And then they're gonna overwinter and then not emerge until the next spring. So a lot of our native bees are spending a lot of time either in those twigs or underground throughout the winter. And then the other life cycle I picked was for bumblebees. And so here we'll just start with winter. So we have a bumblebee queen that's mating with the male. Then that mated queen is going to overwinter in some type of sheltered area. So kind of grassy thickets. Here, I think it's in close proximity to a remaining wood stump, and then she will leave that site in the spring, but she's already mated, so she's able to start laying eggs. So you can see in early summer she's found a nest site location. She's provisioning her nest, and then as the workers emerge, then that's where the colony forms, and there's more individuals present, and so then you can see kind of lots of activity and growth throughout the growing season, and then those new virgin queens leaving the nest late to mate and then find a place to overwinter. But overwintering, that sheltering site being very important for bumblebees as well. And then I threw this in just as a point of interest, and this is actually a picture that I took on campus walking to my office. They had some planters with these yellow asters in there, and these are longhorned bees, and they're males, and they'll sleep together. So this was it's relatively early in the morning coming into the office, and so and they'll just kind of grab on with their mandibles, but they're actually sleeping in aggregation. So it's kind of interesting. You might also find them on grass, other types of structures, but so thinking about kind of shelter and nesting. So in some bees, they'll actually be sleeping away from the nest. In this case, in groups. So next, I wanted to talk about resources available throughout the year. And for this figure, I pulled data that we have from the Stillwater Research Range. So OSU has some rangelands that they do patch burning on. And so we've done many bee surveys out there over the years. And so I just took some of that data and then looked at what plants are we collecting bees off of and when. So it's kind of interesting. So the take home point here, of course, is that different plants are going to be blooming at different times. You've got to cover that whole growing season, right? That they're going to be active, and so what they're using is gonna shift over time. But you can see, here in May and June, so early in the year, our green antelope horn milkweed, which is up here in the upper left-hand corner, was the most used plant species by bees. So and this was from doing netting surveys, right? So you're looking for bees on flowers. Poppy mallow was next on the list for early in the season. We had some prairie fleabane, and actually the slim flower scurf pea is interesting. That's Salvia tenuiflora, but it's interesting because sometimes there might just be a couple tiny little flowers on this plant, but there'll be bees on it. So you'll hear buzzing and you're looking for them, and they found that one flower that happened to be open. But you'll notice that's in terms of being available throughout the year. I guess same thing with the diamond flowers, which are Stenaria nigricans. You know, they're another one to these two that have long blooming periods. And then we've got a lot of ones that bloom kind of either in the middle or later in the season. So then they're actively used, but you can also see, you know, kind of the number of different plants that we're collecting bees from also varies throughout the year. And again, it's based on what's out there and what's available. So if we think about consumers and what they're interested in, you know, the advice always from different organizations is to make sure you've got resources available throughout the year. So they'll be looking for, you know, plants that are blooming early in the middle of the season and then also late as well. And I will say sometimes there are ones that are long blooming, but they're really only used at kind of a more narrow time window than their bloom window, which is always interesting. But again, it's based on what's out there and what's available. So some things that might seem like they're not attractive to pollinators, maybe early in the season, might be the main thing that they use later. So lots of factors to consider. And I'd already mentioned this one, but Asclepias viridis, our green antelope-horn milkweed, was our most visited by bees at the Stillwater Research Range sites. But I borrowed this picture from Brian Reynolds, but a very, very nice one of a bumblebee visiting the flowers. And of course, you know, and actually in this case, you can see, you know, there's 5 different nectaries, which is a characteristics of the milkweed that the bee is collecting nectar from. And then I also wanted to mention nectar robbing. So this is a salvia that I have in my yard, and this is a Carpenter Bee. And you can see the Carpenter Bee is piercing, you know, kind of here at the base of the corolla. So instead of trying to get in there and get the nectar that way, it's called nectar robbing. So and so thinking about the other pollinators that would be out there, you know, they're not necessarily going to readily be able to tell that nothing's available and that the flower's been robbed. But that's a common behavior you'll see with Carpenter bees, as well as some others as too. So nectar, I was going to talk a little bit more about nectar just in terms of availability and how different plants can be, and it doesn't, and the numbers I'm going to present don't necessarily correspond with use, but and I don't know if you can see here, but in the top middle picture, the wild petunia, there's this little glass tube called a microcapillary tube that you can insert into the corolla of a flower, or we use it for a variety of things in science, and it will pull up the nectar with capillary action. And then we have some sugar refractometers, and you can get ones that have the flap or the cover that's adapted to really small samples. So in the case of nectar, you know, we're often dealing with a fraction of a microliter. And so that way you can get measurements for sugar concentration. And the ones we have, there's actually one that ranges from 0 to 45%, and the other one's 45% and above. But you can see for the plants that I picked as an example, for the green antelope horn, it's got about 41% sucrose, but a very small amount of nectar, so about a fifth of a microliter. The diamond flowers or prairie bluets have less sugar concentration, and they are very, very tiny, a very, very small amount of nectar present in them. And then the wild petunia, you know, it's got that long tubular corolla, you know, where a lot of our even larger bodied bees kind of crawl down in there to get the nectar. And so it's less sucrose, so less sugar present, but 2 microliters. So much more nectar present than the other ones. And then of course, if you sample some of the flowers that are typically visited by hummingbirds, you know, for example, I think I've got a picture of Turk's cap at the end, but you know, then you might get many more microliters. Actually, I think the Missouri primrose is one where there's very large quantities of nectar, which is always exciting when you get tired of very small amounts. And then just to put the microliters in perspective, if you think about just a drop of nectar, that would be about 50 microliters. A teaspoon would be close to 5,000. And then if you think about a pound of honey, that takes 2 million flowers to that much nectar to be able to produce, that's 50,000 miles of flying time for a honeybee colony. And so then I'm going to shift gears and talk about pollen. And we're just now starting to look more at the nutritional value of pollen. So pollen can vary in protein, lipids, carbohydrates. So lots of things that can influence its value to bees. And I have a collaborator in the Integrative Biology Department, Sean Wilder, who does a lot of work with nutrition. So he's working on that project. But you can see here with this squash bloom, that the bee comes out and it's covered in pollen. And then, what they'll often do is they'll take the pollen, they'll groom it off their bodies, and they'll pack it onto their legs. So this would be one example where there's very large pollen load on the bee's leg. But some bees will collect pollen in other locations, and some will even carry it internally, like within their crop. And so this megachylons would be a good example. In this case, they're carrying the pollen on the underside of their abdomen, so they have hairs, that project it in a way that it's easy to kind of accumulate that pollen. So this bee is visiting Leatris. And so getting down into the details, but we'll also be interested in, what are the bees collecting? And so certainly you have visitation data where you know what they're visiting, but it's always interesting to actually look at the pollen grains. And I did a study actually years ago when I was working on my PhD down in South Texas, where I identified the different pollen types that feral honeybee colonies were collecting. But we're just now getting back into that. So we're identifying pollen in the lab starting this summer to look at the plant species that bees are visiting. And so I just picked a couple examples here. So Oenothera specious and the evening primrose, and these, I think I tried to keep them to scale, right? So these are sized relative to one another. So the Oenothera has the very, very large pollen grain. And then I put the wild petunia here, and then the Lamiaceae, the mint family. And pollen's interesting. So sometimes you can't kind of break it down like, all grass pollen looks similar, or all different types look similar, but then other ones you can break it down. And so this is, again, from, I guess I graduated in 2003, so from a long time ago, but it just shows you how diverse, and here's corn actually, which is kind of unusual for honeybees to collect, but you can see it's got a very big round pollen grain. It's interesting, the asters you can't really tell apart, but they're kind of grouped here where you've got the high spines, so the spiky one, the low spine, so smaller spikes, and then the Liguliflora, so lots of different pollen grains. So it'll be interesting working with Sean, on like what's the nutritional value of these different ones, and then how does that relate to the bees that are collecting that pollen. So this is an example of honeybee collected pollen, right? So they have their recruitment system. So they're typically collecting pollen from a variety of different plants at the same time, but an individual bee is primarily going to one plant, but you can see you've got kind of different colors of pollen that are likely predominantly made of one type of pollen. So one plant that they're visiting. But the project I was mentioning, we're looking at native bees, but we're also looking at honeybees. And the bees are always, we can go out and do all the plant surveys we want, but the bees are much better at doing a comprehensive job and finding things that we don't find. So it's always interesting to look at the pollen. And so some more context, there are some bees that are specialists, about 20% of bees, where they'll just visit, a few closely related plant species. So for them, the timing of flowering and the timing of the emergence of the bee. Again, if we're thinking about those solitary ground or twig nesters, really matters. But then a whole bunch of other bees are more generalist, and so they'll be visiting a much wider variety of plants, whether it's a garden or a natural environment. And so there's a lot more flexibility for those bees in terms of the plants that they're willing to use. So just to summarize, very generally, so for native bees, they're going to need nest sites, so whether that's leaving some open ground, bare ground in a garden, or those pithy plant stems, or providing some other type of nesting habitat, and then keeping in mind that's also where they're going to be overwintering, so wanting to maintain those pithy stems or the resources you're providing. And then here I have native nectar plants and pollen plants, but of course there's a lot of ornamentals that bees use as well. But we'll talk a little bit later about sometimes it depending on the cultivar, like if you've got the value of that plant could change to bees. So, a lot of the selection for showier flowers might result in fewer floral resources. So something that's become of more interest in the scientific community recently as well. So next I'm going to shift gears and talk about butterflies. So we have close to 600 butterfly species in the US. And I just picked some examples here to walk through. So thinking about butterflies and host plants being one of the obvious connections when you start thinking about having plants available for consumers that want to support butterflies. And I should have put a flower in, but the top row here, we've got a Gulf Fritillary, and they seemed like they were late arriving back. They migrate, so I know I have some at my house now, but they seemed a little later than sometimes. And then here's what the caterpillar looks like, and so it's on passion vine. And if you've seen those flowers, they're really unique. Typically purple and white flowers, very, very large and showy. But that would be the Gulf Fritillary. Also pearl crescents, and so they'll use various different asters. So a lot of times for butterflies, they'll use kind of host plants that are in the same genus, or sometimes even more broadly in the same family. So this is what the caterpillar of the pearl crescent looks like. We've got a question mark over here. So the question mark, there's also one called a comma, but the question mark, it's named based on that little structure on the hind wing that looks kind of like a question mark. And so they're going to be on elm. So I know along my back fence line, for some reason, I always have lots of little elm seedlings coming up. So I'll end up with some question marks and other things back there as well. I've got a black swallowtail. So this one's on brew, but they use parsley and fennel and other types of plants in the carrot family as well. And then I've got a buckeye up here, and so this is on plantains, is what it's on here, but they'll use a variety of other things like snapdragon and aruelia and other plants too. And then this is a sleepy orange, and they're kind of, I thought their eggs are a little bit unique because they're so elongate and pointy, but they'll be on different cassia species in the pea family, and you can see one's laying an egg there. And most of my pictures, unless I put down that they're from somewhere else, are from my yard. So I've tried to accumulate stuff over the years, to sometimes more successful than others. And then I was going to mention, so thinking about butterflies, a lot of times you don't think about where they're going to spend the night, or bad weather, right, if it's raining. And this is just the Bradford pear in my yard, and this is a cloudless sulfur, but they'll kind of roost or find a sheltered place as well. So having some plants with more structure is a lot of times beneficial to butterflies as well. And then overwintering, butterflies pretty much do it all, but each butterfly does one thing, right? So, I went through and just picked some examples. So we've got our question mark again. So question marks and commas will overwinter as adults. So they don't migrate, they just are able to stay the winter. So they'll find some sheltered locations. And so they overwinter as adults. Banded hair streaks will overwinter in the egg stage. So as eggs. Diana Fritillaries, I moved down to the left-hand corner for this one. So this is a male. The male is orange. The female's got dark blue where the male has orange. But they'll overwinter as first instars. So they'll, and they're interesting because the females will lay their eggs actually, I guess about now or on into September in areas where there will be violets. So they're not currently violets. The violets have senesced, but they'll be selecting sites where presumably there will likely be violets in the spring. And then the eggs hatch and they consume their eggshell, and then they'll overwinter as the small first instar stage in some sheltered location. And we just finished a project. We do have Dianas that show up in a variety of locations. And I just actually, I will apologize. I just walked through the regal fritillary life cycle. I was meaning to change that out because I have a graduate student that just finished a project on that one. Dianas are in the same group, so they're somewhat similar, but a little bit different. But we do have them showing up more commonly in the eastern part of Oklahoma as well. I've got the common blues that overwinter in their pupal stage. I kind of went a progression from adult to egg to instar to pupa, and then our giant swallowtails will overwinter in their chrysalis. And then the last one was American ladies, and they'll migrate, not of course as far as monarchs, but I did want to pick a different migrant to highlight here. So they will come back, and Gulf fritillaries would be another one where they're gonna migrate, and we will see them again later in the year. So for butterfly habitat needs, host plants, nectar plants, shelter. And then I did want to talk some more specifically about monarchs. So here's a monarch on a goldenrod. Actually, the leaves in the background here are compass plant. It shoots up a really tall stalk. It's a aster. But anyway, I really like the leaves as well. I hadn't noticed those were back there when I put this in here. And then thinking about monarchs, this is the graph of the size of the area that monarchs occupy on the overwintering grounds. And this is the most recent season here for the 2021 season. And so, monarchs, I guess it was this decline here back in 1314, which raised a lot of alarms given how small the population was at the time. But you can see they do bounce around some, and we've had better years since then, but overall a general decline in the size of the overwintering population. I borrowed a couple pictures from the internet, but this is what the overwintering grounds look like. So the orange on the trees is monarchs. So they're covered with monarchs. And then they kind of overlap. I guess they call it shingling, right? So this is what they actually look like in those trees. And there's been different studies that have made an effort to estimate, how many monarchs do you have in a hectare or certain sized area. And so I think the most recent best guess at this point, and again, it probably varies because they might be more or less densely clustered at different times, different years, different locations, but is a little over 21 million monarchs per hectare. So if you think about the migration, we have monarchs that come through Oklahoma in the spring. You think of them typically moving up and being in the upper Midwest throughout the summer, and then coming back down through Oklahoma for the fall migration. I actually had gotten an email yesterday because people have been seeing monarch caterpillars all summer this summer. It's not always the same, but we do tend to think of them, moving through Oklahoma in the spring, laying eggs, having a generation of adults that then continue to move farther north. And then I always say that we get the breeding monarchs again right about now, so mid-August. And so that would be laying the last generation. But this year, for some reason, we have had monarchs throughout the year, throughout the growing season. So this highlights the different generations and what that looks like. So I think most of you probably know, so the monarchs that migrate south to Mexico in the fall are the same ones that come back and lay eggs in Texas and potentially the southern part of Oklahoma in the spring. So we can go through different generations, but I was kind of highlighting for Oklahoma. We typically see our first monarch, maybe last part of March. And then we'll have them, again, that first generation, possibly a second up until early June. And then we typically see them again in mid-August. This would be an exception, but there are other years that are exceptions as well, where we've had some around. And then we always think of, I think the time, if you were to pick when peak migration, I guess, is supposed to be, it would be late September, early October, but I think the migration has been consistently late for many years, so it extends on well into October in most cases. And then thinking about that last generation that I mentioned, which is relevant to us because there will be a lot of people interested in providing milkweed and supporting that generation. Again, we typically start seeing eggs around mid-August. And then have them develop and then join the fall migration as the migrants come through from farther north. So if we think about that last generation and what does it mean, this is a figure from a paper that was published in 2017, where they were looking at isotopes to try to figure out, like, where are the monarchs on the overwintering grounds coming from. So they actually had monarchs that had been saved, for a lack of a better word, over the years, so from 1976 to 2014, where they could look at this. But you can see, and I'm not sure why they call us the Southwest, but that's what we're called here, but that we have 11% over this time period of monarchs on the overwintering grounds developed, in our region. So that means we do have a large number of individuals that are part of that last generation, which has tended to be overlooked over the years. But then if you kind of break it out across all those different years, it ranges from 5% to 30%. So some years, the monarchs that are laid in Oklahoma and Texas, starting about mid-August or so, are really important, are about a third of the population on the overwintering grounds. So thinking about, monarchs, typically they'll be in the egg stage, and a lot of the development time periods depend on temperature as well as crowding and other issues. But if you can see the egg, it's got these little striations that run from the tip to the base. But they'll be in the egg stage from 3 to 8 days. Then they'll be in the different caterpillar stages up to about 2 weeks. Obviously, milkweed would be important. They'll be in the chrysalis stage. This bunch of chrysalises, we had a project that we were doing in the lab. So we had reared a bunch, and you can see the silk that they use to attach to the top. So if you're very careful, you can kind of pull them off, because we were moving them to separate containers for our research project, and then kind of attach them with that silk. And then the very tip of the chrysalis has this spiky, spiny thing that helps them attach to the silk. But they'll be in the chrysalis stage for a week or two. And then the adult stage, depending on which generation you're looking at, if it's one of the summer breeding ones, they live 2 to 6 weeks. If it's, the overwintering ones, 6 to 9 months, depending on where they start their migration. I get distracted sometimes, but here we have a monarch nectarine on white lantana, and we had a bunch of white lantana one year on campus, and it was hugely popular, but I think it was a challenge to grow, so we haven't had much of that, but there were lots of monarchs on that when we did. So this is just a timing of the 5th generation, or that last generation, but again, we typically see them in mid-August, and this is looking at when we collected late instars that are getting ready to go into that pupal or chrysalis stage. And so we had our peak here, and this was from a few years ago, but this week is September 11th through 17th. So then if you think about them being in their chrysalises for a week or two, they're emerging, kind of in perfect timing to migrate. Of course, there will be late ones that emerge super late and likely aren't going to be successful migrants, but we see that throughout the entire range for monarchs when milkweed is available for them to lay eggs on. So I was going to mention briefly, just milkweed availability. So this is the Asclepias viridis, the green milkweed or antelope horn milkweed, and so all these light green flowers in the background are Asclepias viridis. So we've done surveys, and for lack of a better term, we'll call them native hay meadows, rangelands, roadsides. We'll have anywhere from 500 to 1,000 plants per acre. So it can be quite abundant where it occurs, and it's one you can spot on the roadside when you're driving at highway speeds. So this picture was from early May. And then I came back in August and took another picture. And so the point being that the milkweed plants typically go through their normal cycle. This picture is from early July. And so seed pods will form. And I usually say around July 4th, they'll start releasing seeds. And then once they do that, they're typically going to start dying back. And we've set up a study, but never, for various reasons, it's never exactly happened. But, because if you mow at different times, you'll have the milkweed regrow, but knowing why do certain plants regrow and others don't. And so at one point we had this perfect study set up, and we marked the plants depending on what phenological stage they were in. So we marked them a different color if they had seed pods, we marked them a different color if they had flowers, we spray painted the base of the plants essentially, and we marked them a different color if they were just vegetative with no flowers or reproductive parts. And so, because my thought was maybe it's those vegetative ones that are going to regrow because they haven't had the chance to reproduce yet. But it was actually on OSU property, and they were supposed to mow, and then they didn't mow, and then by the time they did, it was nothing was in the right stage anymore. So I don't know. Because I will say this year I went out and clipped some of my milkweed that had already set seed, and it went ahead and continue to senesce. So I think there's a timing at which it will regrow or not. And I think rainfall is also really important. So, depending on what the rainfall looks like, you could have regrowth as well. But it would be interesting because I think, there's more and more people starting to have native milkweed in their gardens and wanting to know how do you get that to regrow and be here for that last generation. So now I was going to run through some recommendations. In some cases, they're very broad and wide-reaching recommendations, but just some thoughts on that. So my first one, and these pictures mean something to me. they're supposed to trigger my thoughts, so I know what to talk about. But different species may be more or less important to pollinators based on preferences, location, timing of migration, plant phenology, rainfall, etc. So the sunflowers over here on the right side, these asters, there was a area actually on OSU property as well where there were just tons, and we caught tons and tons of monarchs one year, just like tagged bunch, and it was just, great times. It's always nice when you got a good area where you can get a lot in a short amount of time. But then the next year, the migration timing was a little bit different. The phenology of the plants might have been a little different. And pretty much they were all past blooming by the time we had mini monarchs. So we got nothing from that site, the next year. So it really varies a lot. And so I think that's probably a difficult thing for consumers to think about too. But so a plant that might be very good for 1 year because of the timing, might not be so good the next year. So, but of course, there's lots of other pollinators, out there during the blooming period that would be using these plants as well. But I think that's an important point to make, that especially since the migration timing shifts, having plants that are available at slightly different times during that fall migration can make a big difference. Oh, and I guess I think this one's actually from the field by my house. Some of the purple aster, and I did not update this one to my more recent one, but we've had a few periods of quite a bit of rain recently. One on campus a couple weeks ago. I think somebody texted me and said they had gotten soaked on a walk like a couple days ago. But I've had not a drop of water, at my house. But it doesn't look great, but it's doing okay. So that is another advantage of kind of native plants, maybe being a little bit less requiring less work, because I have not watered once this year. And I just don't generally get to it. And then in many cases, perennial plants will provide more floral resources than annuals. There are some exceptions, like zinnias, the butterflies just love, wherever they happen to come up. So it kind of varies depending, so there's not one definitive answer for everything. We've looked at some different graphs and I guess talked about it in different contexts, but that pollinators need floral resources throughout the growing season, and in particular hitting the very early and very late parts of that growing season, and maybe the middle when sometimes there's just not much, but making sure that there is availability throughout. So a lot of times, I think more and more so because it's being emphasized so much. When you get a fact sheet or information about how to support pollinators, is making sure that there's resources throughout the growing period, and so people are really interested in what blooms when and wanting to have that information. Providing multiple individuals of the same species is beneficial, and it's especially important for host plants, for butterflies. But also if we think about native bees, and if they're primarily collecting the same pollen type in one load, if there's not much of it, then they're not gonna have much to put in that pollen pellet. And I guess this one, so this is a tiny milkweed plant that regrew after some disturbance, also on OSU property. And so this video is meant to emphasize the importance of having lots of plants available. So we'll see how many eggs, and it was one where I couldn't take a picture to capture all the eggs, right? Because there's just so many eggs on this little tiny plant. Oh yeah, you can see a lot around the corner as well. So needing to have lots of plants available for butterflies to lay their eggs on, and also thinking about how much they consume. So I put in a couple videos. So this is a monarch caterpillar, and this is actual time. I didn't speed it up or anything, but you can. And this is a 5th instar. You might be able to. So the last instar stage, but they can eat super quick. And consume a lot. He's just chowing down on the milkweed. And so, if you've got one milkweed plant, that might not be enough to get your caterpillar through. And if we think about monarchs, if we think about all the eggs that are laid, less than 10% of those are actually going to end up resulting in an actual butterfly, right? So, there's predation, other various things, disease that happen to the caterpillars. And so you need to provide milkweed to support 10 times as many caterpillars as you want to produce for monarchs, right? Because you're gonna if less than 10% of those eggs are going to make it, is really important. And then this one is a black swallowtail caterpillar on rue. And you can see they both kind of take that same approach. And it's reminding me of, how do people eat corn on the cob, right? You can debate what approach one should use, but you can see he's consuming a lot of plant material as well. And it's interesting, sometimes in the heat of the day when you go out, like they'll be eating nothing. They're just sitting there on the plant. Looks like they're not going to consume anything. And then you go out, perhaps when it's a little bit cooler, early or late, and they're just eating like crazy. And then my last one, I think this is actually my last one, but one can never get tired of watching caterpillars eat. These are the Gulf Fritillaries caterpillars that are on passion vine. Happen to have two of them. I think the one's going to fall off when the bigger one eats its way through the leaf. But they're eating away as well. So some other thoughts about what consumers will be interested in providing. And I had mentioned hybrids and cultivars that are bred for size or showiness, like if you think about the double petals or the showy sepals. A lot of times the selection process ends up, the plants that have those features that are desired have fewer floral resources because they're investing more in those other features. So they might be attractive, but they might not provide as much resources, right? So I guess, wanting to be careful that when you're advertising something or selecting something that you're expecting to be a good resource for pollinators, occasionally one might not be correct on that for some of the selections. And so this one is a Salvia, and I'm not really sure why I put it in other than it's cool. And so this one, it was during migration, and we were collecting monarchs to tag. And it's kind of hard, and it slows you down if you have to swing the net and then get them out of the net. But if they're really hungry, depending on what conditions were farther north or what's happening, right? So they might have been flying and they're dropping down to nectar. And then they've got to build up their lipid reserves for overwintering. But if it's a little bit windy or something where they have to hold on tight, I mean, sometimes you can just pluck them off of the flowers. And that's at the OSU Botanic Garden. And actually, I've got a slide with Turk's cap at the end about hummingbirds, and this is some Turk's cap at the bottom here. So you can also think about, and this would be true not just in urban areas, but throughout in any area, that most plants are going to attract few, if any, insects, but a few are going to be highly attractive. And again, what that looks like can change over time or be different between years, for many different reasons. And like even thinking about nectar, there's so many factors that influence what nectar production looks like rainfall and temperature and sunlight. And so there's so many things that influence what looks good. So in general, I think plants that are going to be advertised as pollinator friendly are going to be more attractive than some of the other ones. And there are lists all over the place now about recommendations on what to plant for pollinators, right? So, it's good to, the lists come from various sources. Some are really good, some are not so good, and some are really broad, right? So they might just say asters. Well, it really depends on what you get for what's going to be attractive. But I think there is a lot of interest in having that information when consumers are going to purchase plants to know what they can expect. But yeah, keeping a watch on what's being promoted by different organizations is helpful. And so this one, I don't know if you can see, but in the background there's lots of little pearl crescents. If you can see the wings flapping. This is frog fruit, Phylonodoflora, and it's kind of a vining, creeping type of plant. And I planted just a handful of plants years ago, and it's great ground cover. So I'm kind of hoping it will keep spreading. But the pearl crescents just love it. So I have much more than I did originally. And one thing that shows up repeatedly in recommendations to consumers, and so they will likely be asking growers more and more if they're applying pesticides. If so, what are they applying? So it's good to think about that. And certainly from the research or conservation perspective, I think this picture highlights the importance of finding a balance between short and long-term management goals, right? So I used to go to this site. I haven't actually checked it out in a while. It's just a field at the corner of an intersection. But there in the background is some green antelope horn milkweed. You can see it flowering. But then you've got all this Johnson grass, and so clearly something needs to be done. So trying to find that balance between, if you don't do something, you're not going to have any habitat. So there's got to be a trade-off for that as well. And I had talked about in particular in the context of native bees, delaying fall cleanup until late spring. So providing those nest sites. And again, those nest sites, their only value is if those bees are going to emerge the following spring, right? So they've got to make it through the winter, because they're in those nests through the winter. And finding a balance between benefits of mulching and direct access to bare ground for ground nesting bees. And I guess also perhaps a balance with all the volunteers one gets if you don't have much mulch, which sometimes are a good thing and sometimes maybe aren't. And this is another one of those posters that's available through the Pollinator Partnership. And it's specifically in the context of agriculture, but I mean, it's all the same, right? I think it applies to homeowners in urban areas as well. If you look what they talk about, so over in the corner, they're talking about providing resources throughout the growing season, providing resources for managed and native pollinators, including native plants to support a diversity of pollinators, floral strips or habitat corridors, integrated pest management, so all of the things that we think about is also, they're also relevant in most contexts, so they would apply to urban and garden settings as well. And now I picked some, well, perhaps random research findings, but some things I thought might be of interest, so kind of going in different directions. So the first one I was going to talk about would be body sizes of native bees. So over the years, we've done a lot looking at abundance and diversity of native bees, and to be honest, it's getting kind of boring. It's always nice to change it up. So we've gotten more interested in body size, and so most research that's looked at body size have focused on, that they'll measure a handful of bees for each species and then look at it kind of at the community level. But there's lots of differences within individual bee species. So this would be some examples. So when we measure bee body size, one of the common ways to do that, this picture in the upper right-hand corner, is to measure the intertegular span. So the tegula are these little round structures that are at the base of the wings. And so then you measure the distance between those, and that gives you an idea of body size, which kind of correlates with flight distance and things like that. Apis, that would be the genus that includes honeybees, and then we've got Bombus, the genus that includes bumblebees, and then some Lasioglossum and Adrena, which are just some other examples. But their flight distances are going to vary dramatically depending on body size. And so then if you think about within one type of bee, if body size is variable, what does that mean? And it might be another way to look at what are the implications of these, of what's out there in the landscape for bees, or these management practices, or other types of things. So we've gotten more interested in that. And so this is canola, and we have, I guess we're not done. We anyway, seem to have projects associated with canola for a long time now. And so, so for native bees, a lot of times you'll use some type of, we call them pan traps, to you kind of put out there, and they passively collect bees, and you just go back and get them. And so, this would be an example, so white, blue, and yellow, attract different bee species. This was on a platform that was like at the level of the canola flowers, but we put them out at different distances into the canola fields. And then we looked at some of the kind of more common bee species that we found in those traps, and then looked at their body size. So this is the intertegular span. So this is an estimate of their body size in relation to distance into the field. So it's really interesting. We'll start on the top. So the one on the top, you can see there's lots of variation, but they tend to be larger at this intermediate distance. For the middle species, Agapostomon texanus, they were smaller, suggesting that the smaller bees weren't making it very far into the field, and the larger bees are the ones that are farther over. And then for the Coletes, kind of same pattern, the smaller bees aren't making it deep into the field. So that's got a lot of implications. If there's something about sites that are resulting in bees being smaller in body size, we might have issues with crop pollination and other types of things. So I think it's an interesting approach, by looking at multiple individuals of the same type. And we also looked at, kind of what the surrounding landscape looks like, and we don't necessarily have any definitive conclusions from this, but it was kind of interesting. So for Lasioglossum, body size actually decreased as the amount of grass and pasture increased, which is maybe not what you would expect, except for, kind of in the canola wheat growing region of the state, there's maybe not a lot of resources in that grass and pasture areas. But for Agapostomon, we kind of found the opposite. Their body size increased as grass and pasture area increased. So maybe it's got something to do with preferred nesting sites, or activity periods, or other types of things. And then for Coletes, it's a little bit different. We have the intertegular span plotted against low density development. And so there, as low density development increased, body size decreased. But I think lots of interesting directions to potentially go with this. Another thing for native bees is looking at sex ratios. So you can count the antennal segments to determine if you've got males or females, and kind of looking at so kind of going beyond abundance and diversity, and focusing on more details about what's going on and what's driving patterns that we see. Now I'm going to shift gears entirely. Again, I picked some very different topics. So looking at milkweed age, population structure, and phenology. This is one of our roadside sites on 51 going west from Stillwater towards 35. And all of these flags, we actually went out and flagged all the milkweed plants we could find. So you can see there's a bunch out there. So some of them you can actually see in the picture, but there's a whole bunch, once you start looking, so it makes you just realize how much is actually out there. So there, Justin D, who graduated maybe a year or two ago from the Plant Biology, Ecology, and Evolution Department, he looks at herb chronology. So he'll take different forbs for species, and they have to have certain characteristics, but he can actually look kind of like looking at tree rings. He can look at the rings within the tuber. to be able to tell how old the plants are. And so, and he's done a variety of different projects to kind of show that it works, right? So this is, our most common milkweed, Asclepias viridis. And so you can see it's got kind of multiple branches, but you can see this big tuber. It also kind of explains why if you've got a site that's, been grown up or you haven't seen milkweed in a while and like you burn it or something, there the plants will be, and they'll clearly be large plants. And so this graph might be confusing. We were kind of comparing mowing regimes and grasslands and roadsides, but the take home point here is of the plants that we looked at, the average age was about 12 and a half years, which is just phenomenal. And the maximum age was 25. And roadsides were very similar. There was no difference, even though they're mowed more frequently. So the mean age was about 12 and the maximum age was 20. So very interesting and exciting. And then I just threw this in as kind of random and related to the milkweed. So I always try to find my first milkweed of the season. Journey North is a citizen science project that looks at phenology. And so it's really easy. You can just go submit like, what's the first time you saw something? They also do monarch eggs and adults and migration and peak migration and a lot of things. But there's this roadside site that I always, near my house, that I always look at for my first milkweed. So I kind of missed this one coming up by maybe a couple of days, but you'll see this is March 18th. And this was from a few years ago, but I tried to take the same picture frame each time. And so on March 19th, it looked a little bigger and you could already see buds present, which is crazy. And there it is. So March, sorry, I'm going backwards. So March 18th, March 19th, March 20th, March 21st, and March 22nd. You'll notice it's even grown outside of the frame of my picture. So within 5 days, it just, anyway, I have gotten more and more interested in phenology. And so it's always interesting. And so, a lot of it's too looking at when you see your first milkweed each year and what's influencing when you have that emergence. And flowering phenology, of course, would be really relevant as well. And next, I'm going to talk about monarch weight, wing size, and coloration in the context of migration. So it's interesting when you start looking at monarchs. And so these are two that were collected about on the right-hand side that were collected about the same time. You see one's, pretty large. The other one's pretty thin. And so we typically, when we're tagging monarchs during migration, we'll weigh them. So we'll get an idea. And I'm collaborating on a project where they're looking at lipids to try to see at different points along the migration route where are they accumulating those lipids that are going to allow them to survive, the winter on those overwintering grounds in Mexico. You can also see, differences in wing size. So, and we'll end up with some really tiny monarchs. This guy looks small, but there's some that are much smaller. And then wing color, so this one has a lot more orange than this one. The hind wing is actually pretty pale. So there's lots of things that you can look at. And it has been research that has suggested that the redder that the wings are, the more successful the migrants will be. And so they've looked at kind of patterns over time. And so we've been kind of looking at this from a variety of angles and collecting data over many years. But now I'm going to show you something that doesn't have anything to do with those pictures. So looking at the sex ratio, so the number of males to females. So you would expect there to be 50% females and 50% males. And so there has been concern that's been documented in the literature about the number of females decreasing. And there's been proposed explanations related to parasites that might impact females to a greater extent than males, things like that. Is there some issue with survivability? But what was really interesting, or are they dropping out? Are you losing them somewhere along the migration route? Or, are there some issues? But we looked at our migrants, and we've got data for multiple years, but the graph is just for 2017. And then we looked at that 5th generation. So those are the ones that are caterpillars, eggs and caterpillars in Oklahoma from mid-August to end of September when they're emerging as adults. And what's interesting is the sex ratios are right about the same, right? So there's so it's certainly whatever is resulting in the decline in the number of females is happening at somewhere during development, right? So it's not something that's being selected for after, because we've got very similar values. So that's pretty interesting. And then I was going to throw in tropical milkweed just because that often comes up, thinking about nurseries and growers and things. And this is from a project in Texas that one of my graduate students worked on. And so he had a bunch of different sites. He had some roadside sites, grassland sites, garden sites, like several different locations in Texas. And so we've got a bunch of different species that he was looking at. So tropical milkweed is the one that's highlighted in green. It's Asclepias curasabica. And so he looked at egg densities. So for plants that contained eggs, how many eggs were on those plants. And you will notice that for the tropical milkweed, there's many more eggs than there are for the other native milkweed plants. And so some of the concerns related to tropical have been related to disease and monarchs staying longer because there's green milkweed present, but there could also be issues associated with sometimes it's referred to as egg dumping, but where there's a lot of eggs and not. And so you can certainly see in this example, and this is actually one from the lab, so we did feed them and nobody ran out of food, but if you've got a whole bunch of eggs being laid on plants, you're going to end up with way too many caterpillars, more than can be supported. And then if they end up having to pupate earlier, then they're going to likely be smaller, and all of these things contribute to less success. But I think for us in Oklahoma, our tropical milkweed does die back. It's not going to be around during the winter. I don't know that we have problems like they do, for example, along the Gulf Coast where it stays green for much of the year. And then I was just going to mention hummingbirds. I haven't worked with hummingbirds in a very long time. I worked on them for my master's, but I worked down in South Texas where Turk's cap was very common. It was the main thing they used during the summer. And I stole this picture. I guess my master's, because I graduated in 1999. I think that's right. But so I worked with buff-bellied and black-chinned hummingbirds, but I have Turk's cap in my yard, and so I don't put out any feeders. I always say I have enough flowers for them. But anyway, I was just out and unsuccessfully getting pictures of hummingbirds on my Turk's cap. But I would love to work with hummingbirds again. So and again, Turk's cap will be used by a variety of different butterfly species. I haven't seen bees as much. I'll have to look for that. And what's interesting, there's people that record all the butterflies they see in their yard, but what would be cool would be to record all the different pollinators that are using a particular plant in your yard. So I just wanted to mention Turk's cap because I was just admiring mine. And with that, and this is, I think I've had this flower in multiple pictures, but this is a yellow crownbeard, which is a annual, but it reseeds readily and is a great resource, Verbicina, for a variety of pollinators. So I've got, I think many pictures with bees and butterflies and other things as well. And with that, if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Questions for Dr. Baum? Make sure you write those out while we've got her here. Kristen, I have a question. I should have taken better notes, but I was sweating some technical problems here today with this not on your and my end. When you're looking at nutritional value of some of those flowers that you covered earlier, what are some of the main things that you're concerned about?
So we primarily, and based on, I guess, the work that Sean Wilder does, you were looking at proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. And so, and it's interesting in the literature, there's some discussion about, given resources, like can the bees identify the nutritional value of what they're collecting, right? So there's been some studies that have looked at that, but I think, in our case, and we don't necessarily know what's the optimal, right? So so you just know what they do, but so we're comparing different landscapes, right? So with different compositions to see if we're going to have big differences in nutritional value. And at least with honeybees, and we do have some honeybee colonies we're using for some of this, and we can have an easier comparison among sites. Native bees are a little bit more challenged to work with in that context. But I think, I think that will add a whole nother piece. And actually another colleague, Jason Belden, does kind of toxicology type work. So we're also looking at insecticides and pesticides and what that looks like in those systems as well. So.
Okay, thank you.
Well, and if anybody has questions later, they are welcome to send me an email as well.
We appreciate that offer. Be careful what you offer, but that's awesome. And like I mentioned before to everybody, there'll be a YouTube of Dr. Baum's presentation, probably right in a couple of weeks. And then so for your friends and colleagues that miss us, let them know early September, she'll be on again, so to speak. 3 a.m, weekends, whenever. So. And Kristen, we look forward to getting you back to a good old-fashioned workshop too someday, or we can all huddle and talk. But this was fantastic today,
and we had just been looking at the chat, but I noticed there's a question and answer box too, and there was a question about the egg loads, and so that is David Berman, who's one of my PhD students, and he's working on he has all of his data. So now he has to just do all the work with it. But that's one of the things we're looking at because he does have, kind of that range of sites from natural to, I guess, the urban garden types of settings. And so, so he will be working on getting that finalized with those different land use and I guess regional perspective as well, since he's got sites in different locations across Texas.
Anyone else has questions by chance? I have this is surely out of ignorance, but on the Asclepias, how about, given the sheer diversity of Asclepias species in the US, and we have a huge country, what about when people like me and others bring in, you mentioned the tropical one, but in this case, they're technically indigenous, but to other parts of the country, any issues with local populations of monarchs or anything else where you're having large chasms of space between the plant and the species, the butterfly?
So thinking about planting natives in different locations, or?
Well, I was mentioning, I didn't say it well, but Asclepias, let's say, that are more native towards the West Coast and aren't indigenous in this part of the world. Has there been any work that just because they're not found out in the roadsides or the ditches or readily available out in the wild, so to speak, of Oklahoma or even peripheral states, that they're any less valuable as the butterflies are passing through?
So there have been some studies comparing different milkweed species, so seeing what preferences are for egg laying. And I will say, I think it also depends on kind of where you're at, what availability is, because I think it changes, because I know I have a colleague, where we'll discuss butterfly weed, so tuberosa, and whether it's good. I think it depends. So I think certain areas it's used more than others. You know, I know there's been an effort to kind of document all the species that are being used. And, you know, it is interesting with the focus on having more native milkweeds available, you know, which aren't, you know, haven't traditionally, other than, so Asclepias tuberosa or butterfly weed is the one that's been commercially available, right? So now providing other natives that traditionally haven't been, you know, is interesting. And then also, and I have a colleague here as well in plant biology who, you know, his research area is, he works with milkweeds, right? So I asked him before, you know, so what do you think it means, you know, if you're interested in, you know, genetics or something for milkweeds, you know, that we're planting, you know, milkweed in lots of locations. So I think he was just, you know, fine with more milkweed everywhere. But you know, it is interesting thinking about a lot of those changes. And I would say, you know, one of the only ones that's maybe, because common milkweed is one where we don't see much of it until you get farther north in Oklahoma. But that is one that's sometimes available. But again, not one that we would typically find growing, you know, in the kind of central or southern part of the state, just mainly up at the northern border. But I will say I have a plant in my garden that is taking forever to get established of common milkweeds. So we'll see if it does much in the future.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Otherwise, we're going to let Dr. Baum get back to her other duties. Kristen, we appreciate your time. Look forward to staying in touch with you. Again, look forward to having you in a traditional workshop at some point in time in the future. But until then, this is fantastic and really fascinating to watch different areas of your work and your graduate students. Look forward to seeing what else you turn out in the journals and the popular magazines and lectures down the road. So thanks again for your time, okay?
Thank you.
You bet. Have a great day. Everybody else for that matter. Bye-bye.